Welcome everyone to the second episode of Forensic Pixology. I'm here again with Corey, and today we're going to discuss MegaMan 2. So without further ado, take it away, Corey.
Hey, how's it going? This game, MegaMan 2, is a classic. Everyone remembers this game. That was an NES fan in any sense. And that's why it's important that we review this one, because a lot of people remember it being special, but they may not remember why, and there are lots of little tricks and graphical things that they did with this game that make it pretty unique and stand out compared to a lot of other games on the NES.
Absolutely.
So,
and just great gameplay.
Yeah, yes,
sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Did you want to talk about anything on this particular single screen right now, or should we move right to the video to discuss the splash screen?
I would say, yeah, we can move to the video and discuss that.
Right.
This little intro that everyone remembers.
Okay,
So.
let me bring that on and maximize it here. And get it playing. And I can pause it whenever you need me to.
And what's interesting about this is that, we've discussed how you can only do horizontal screen slicing to pull off things like parallax effects.
Right, things moving at different speeds, parts of the screen
Right,
moving at different speeds.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. But they're doing it here with a vertical scroll, which is interesting, and you're wondering, like, are they just slicing off that building there?
Right.
But they were very clever with how they did this.
Right, because literally
once you notice the movement. Yeah.
Right, on the 8-bit Nintendo, they can only slice, which was typical for almost all systems. So you can only do that trick of slicing the screen horizontally, not vertically. Mm-hmm. So seeing this game, if you have that technical information in your mind, it's really shocking that they pulled off this giant portion of the screen scrolling at a different speed. And it's even more shocking to eventually find out or realize how they pulled off this amazing effect.
Yep.
So I can rewind a bit if you want.
Yeah, and so once the scrolling starts, you can see the building is obviously moving a little bit faster than the background.
Yep.
What they're doing here is clever use of sprites. The windows and those little notch portions of the building that are sticking out are sprites. And the building itself, even though it is made of tiles, they did not put any horizontal lines on it. It's all vertical strips
that go all the way up the entire screen.
Yep, so it is actually, the tiles in the building are scrolling at the same speed as that background, but the sprites on it are giving it the illusion that it's moving differently.
So really,
you'll never know otherwise.
It's really brilliant work, because and we will see the same trick being used for bosses, but in a horizontal sense, so that they wouldn't need to use that extra processing power or create that little glitch by slicing the screen. They do the same thing in a horizontal sense, where if you think of it this way, the whole screen is going to be scrolling vertically at one speed. But if they want to hide the potential speed of scrolling of another section, they can design that section using nothing but lines that go up the entire height of the screen. And because the detail of that entire column of pixels is identical, you can't sense the scrolling in any way. So basically it's scrolling at a zero speed. So it's only the details where you can sort of figure out the vertical position of details. That's how you can tell how quickly that entire structure is moving. And since we all know what a building looks like and we all know what windows are, then because these few details, because these are spaced out and we can see their movement vertically, that creates the illusion that the entire building structure is moving vertically, when in fact only these nodules on the side are protruding from the side, and only these windows are. So yeah, really brilliant stuff. And go ahead.
I was about to say, it could have been, and I don't know this for sure, but it could have been possible that they they designed this first with just the window idea,
Mm-hmm.
and then they realized, hey, we could put something on the side of the building here
Right.
that, is the same color as the building,
Right.
and it gives, it hangs over that background.
Right. Just gives it so much more depth. Right.
Right. And so it's not that clean break
Right.
from it. So
Right.
I think that was a very, very nice addition, more than just the windows, to really sell the illusion.
Yeah, I would say it easily doubles not only the effectiveness of the illusion, but also just the overall appeal and sense of depth and separation of the building as a whole from the background. Because imagine if it was just those windows. Because the windows are in those black tracks with the two lines, people could actually think, oh, the building is scrolling the same speed as the background, but maybe those are like elevators moving quickly upward or downward. So the fact that you're now putting solid architecture that obviously isn't supposed to be moving separate from the building. It's the same color as the building. It's not like a window or an elevator or something. That really helps really sell it. And as you said, the overlap, the way you've got these non-square shapes, they don't go the full height, and they overlap over the background. That just really completely sells that separation and helps sell the building as just this solid structure that, of course, is all moving at the same speed. So really brilliant. They did a really brilliant job. Go ahead.
Yep. And then once you get past this section, when you see the city and the skyline totally get off screen,
right?
This is where they pull an interesting trick. The top of the building is drawn with tiles, right? So they're actually, at that point, they quickly begin scrolling that particular map at the same speed as the windows and the side portions.
Right, really, really clever. So basically the whole screen was scrolling the slow speed of the background, and the sprites were making the illusion that the building was scrolling faster. But at the exact moment that you no longer see that far background anymore, they can instantaneously change the scrolling speed to match the exact speed of the windows and these protuberances that make the building look like it's scrolling faster. So now the whole screen is in fact scrolling that speed, and that's what allows you to finally reach the top of the building, and it's perfectly seamless. It seems like, yeah, the building was always scrolling at that speed, which was just faster than the background. And then so what do you think about, we were discussing this earlier, this is quite a bit of tiles, they reuse them well, but this is quite a lot of tiles and a unique palette, or two unique palettes, probably more than two. So they had the one palette here, they had like 3 palettes here and 1 palette here, which is all 4 palettes. But when they get up to the top of the screen, there we go. When we get up to the top of the... Why is YouTube acting funny? Do you see this? I'm like trying to skip around and it's not going anywhere, but it's acting like it's playing. I'm going to refresh it. It's acting real... I've never seen that before. There we go. So now we're up at the top of the screen. And so now they needed new palettes and probably new tiles too, because there's a good chance that used up all the tiles before with all those background buildings.
Yeah, because that logo they'd have a pretty tough time fitting all that into the tile space. I mean, like it probably barely fits along with the little bits of the
top of the building
tiles they used for that building, which is very minimal,
Right.
And then, of course, the font they had to fit in there. So
what they almost certainly did was, during that exact moment when the background is gone, while they're changing the scroll speed, they are also changing those 3 tile palettes. They're leaving the building tile palette alone, but the other 3 tile palettes they're changing to the palettes needed for the title screen, and they are also swapping those background environment art tiles out of memory and loading from the cartridge the tiles needed for the Mega Man 2 logo, which is just beautifully done. Like, it's pretty amazing that logo is made out of basically just, I think, 2 3-color plus black palettes. Like you were there, we were Corey and I were having this discussion. Was that last night? And I was so tired. I just, or was it the night before? Or it may have been day for you. I don't know. We're in 2 different time zones. But I was really tired, and they kept fumbling, trying to count these colors, and I was absolutely convinced that that there were more than 3 colors plus black. You could see like this drop shadow color they used is this kind of very dull bluish greenish gray, I guess you could call it, super dull turquoise, and I thought for sure that what looked like this darkest blue color was a different color from that drop shadow, but it's just because it's separated with those white pixels on the stroke of the lettering that really helps that color work both ways as the drop shadow and as that darkest sort of blue color in the chrome effect. So just absolutely brilliantly done opening scene, and of course the super memorable and beautiful music. The soundtrack of the entire Mega Man franchise is fantastic. So we'll just look at that one more time to really appreciate everything that's going on and how beautifully that parallax effect is pulled off. And I guess the only other thing that we can point out at all about this is the and by the way, Mega Man is a sprite. But the other thing that I was going to mention that we discussed before, it was also very smart of them to offset the vertical position of that node or protuberance on the building from the windows. That way you don't have to worry about sprite flicker if you had all of them lined up all the way across. And it's also offsetting the details that you can see scrolling. So that just also helps make it look like the whole building is moving all at the same speed. So really, really smart stuff. Anyway, so there's that, and we can go back to the folder of all the screen grabs that Corey was nice enough to get for us. What screen would you like to discuss next?
Well, I guess I don't know if you want to get into maybe more of the large sprite or large like boss type characters, or if you want to talk about effects,
like Dog Guy, or
yeah, we can pull up Dog Guy.
All right. Any particular screen? 1, 2, or 3? Does it matter?
I guess we can do the first one.
Okay.
For now,
Right.
And.
How did they get such a giant enemy on the screen on the 8-bit Nintendo? Tell me, Corey, how?
Well, this is basically just tiles. And it's interesting because I believe if you see this guy moving, his head shifts a little bit, so they had to draw his whole head with sprites.
Right.
And this was,
hence
the
most
flicker.
Of the time, you can see sprite flicker right here on his jaw because there's too many sprites apparently between his head, the jaw, and these 3 objects here. Which this one object is 2 sprites wide at least. I think it's 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that was very smart of them to build. You'll notice this is black and then. Only 2 colors, except for the remember the white in the eye. That's just the head's a sprite anyway. But the point is, you might ask yourself, where's the 3rd color they could have used? But remember, this is tiles. So in order to really pull off the illusion that this is a separate character standing in front of the background, they had a 1-color background plus black. So the background is built into the tiles for this enemy as well.
Yep.
So that's the missing 3rd color. So you got the background color, dark blue and light blue, and then the black stroke, which is universal to all of the tile palettes.
Yeah, it was an interesting choice because you don't see that very often. Most of the time people will just go with the straight black so they can reserve those extra colors for the character. Right. And that sort of did limit their use of this enemy. Like, they can really only put him in this level because it's got that tile design back there. So that was a choice they made, but I guess they knew, they were only going to put him in this level.
Right,
so.
Exactly. But it's like we talk about, everything is making decisions based on sort of payoff versus price. And if they kept with only a black background for these giant enemies, then that would of course slightly degrade the sense of the overall layout. Like if you look at this screen now that I blacken out the background color, it just feels a little cheaper. It feels a little less like it's on a less powerful console. It feels like they had less memory perhaps. There's less of a sense of depth because there's no background to see anymore. It's just this black negative space. But the other good things that would have come from that trade-off, they would have been able to have a whole extra color in this enemy, so he could have looked better. There was one other positive point I was going to say. Oh, also, they could have reused his tiles to put him in other environments. Whereas because this particular background is built right into his tile art, he can only be over that particular background style, that background art. They could change the palette, so it could be a blue background or a red one or whatever, right? Like if you changed that particular tile palette, for example, to something like that, that would work, but like you couldn't put him over a drastically different looking background with a different background tile without having all of that art, like whole duplicate tiles for the entire Dogman character.
Yep.
Or dog guy, I should say. But yeah, so that's definitely a really clever way. And keep in mind, like when the guy blows up, all you do is replace the tiles where he is with the regular background tiles and show a few explosion sprites, and you're good to go.
And something that's, I guess you could say, is a negative of this game. As awesome as it plays and as great as a lot of the art is, I noticed just seeing it recently again that there is quite a lot of sprite flicker in this game, more than you would probably remember. And this guy in particular, or this dog guy, whatever I called him, Wolf maybe, I don't know, but he shoots these fireballs, but they come out in like a big long stream in some
there's another screen that you had grabbed that I can load up that really shows just they were not worried about the flicker, huh? Look at how many.
Right.
And then, remember, this is at least 2 sprites wide on its own. And you know darn well MegaMan is going to be somewhere in this mix. So, in this region, you have at least 4 sprites overlapping. And then you've got MegaMan, which at his widest is at least 4 sprites. And then he's going to be shooting, actually 5, counting his face as separate sprites. And then you've got his shots. So the odds of having a massive amount of flicker during this sequence is very high.
Yeah, and you can even see it there on the guy's face, like there's little pieces, kind of pieces missing from his head.
And if MegaMan fell down to this point, like right about here, especially if he was shooting, there would be, MegaMan and or his shots or these, they would all be flickering quite a lot.
Yep. So it's not perfect. This shows the difference between a company like Capcom versus Nintendo back in the day. Nintendo, as we discussed in the Mario 3 discussion, they were extremely careful with the flicker. It's present in the game, but it's very, very minimal. And like we said, they were working with the limitations as much as possible. Whereas Capcom, I feel like, was more... They wanted to put the art they wanted in the game regardless of the limitations. Yeah. They worked around them to an extent, but there is massive flicker in this game all over the place.
Absolutely. It seemed like with Mario, and keep in mind, that was Nintendo. That was in-house. The same company that made the hardware was making the software. Or you know what I mean? It was all under the same ownership. So you can imagine there quite likely could have been more pressure on Nintendo developers to show the hardware in the best possible light.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I
so
would
the sort of
imagine so,
attitude, the attitude could very well have been work well, understand well, and work well around and within those very specific hardware constraints. And one of the things that shows that you're overtaxing the system itself is flicker. And so it was very obvious when we reviewed Mario 3 how they both the artist and the level designers combined worked hard to minimize flicker as much as possible without compromising the gameplay and without compromising the art too much. So it's interesting. I think you're totally spot on when it comes to Capcom. Equally high quality standards, but from a different point of view. You could tell that they and if you don't mind, I'll go to the like this boss is the best example, I think. There's also the dragon boss, which I have in a sprite rip sheet. But if you take a look at Tank Boss,
yeah,
look at this giant piece of freehand art, right?
right.
So when you look at every big, like, large boss character in Mega Man 2 specifically, but in general in the series, it's obvious, and this is where we get the word forensic pixology from. We can tell sort of a workflow and a mindset by the end resulting pixel art. And what I mean in this case is it's obvious that they had a really good staff of very good concept artists and character designers, or maybe one, but at least one. And when they were tasked with designing these characters, and especially these bosses, you could tell they freehand drew it, and they weren't super worried about, like, obviously they gave some consideration to the color limitations, but you could tell it was sort of design the coolest enemy possible, and then sort of fight with the limitations to get it to work, right? To get it on screen, staying as true to the original sort of freehand design as possible. Whereas the other approach, where like a company like Nintendo likely would have done, is say, okay, here are the limitations. Now let's design the coolest, nicest looking enemy we can within those limitations. And the end result is going to be, especially on box art, a Mega Man game is going to look cooler in the sense that it's going to have big, colorful, freehand drawn, like, large enemies on screen. But the downside is when you actually play both games side by side, the Mega Man, the Capcom game, is going to have a lot more flicker. So obviously when they're doing screenshots, they're going to take a lot of screenshots and make sure that the ones that end up on the box don't show all of the flicker going on. Whereas it's going to be a much less of an issue in a Mario game where they were more careful to begin with in designing their enemies to not require so many sprites. And one of the ways that you can avoid the need for sprites goes into the whole aspect of tiles and tile palettes and the ability to create moving or animated things with animated tiles.
Right.
So do you want to talk a little bit about... while we're still on this guy... I don't think we have any video footage of him lined up, but one really cool thing they did do with him that was really nice and very optimized was down here, the tank treads and the little round spinny things that move the tank treads. That's a nice, simple two-color palette change. They call it color cycling.
Mm-hmm.
So I can actually simulate it. Like, I'll just do a one-frame simulation, but if we just swap out this color with this color, you'll see that change, and it looks like the tank treads move, and it looked like these spun. So you can imagine if we just keep swapping those back and forth, there we go. We get this nice illusion of movement that takes no new sprite data and just a tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of code that says every so many fractions of a second, swap the RGB value of these two. Or Nintendo doesn't even have RGB values. It's just saying, switch which color is being displayed in which index. And so that was a really nice, efficient use of tiles. So the only big problem was the characters, in this case, the character's jaw opens and closes. Mm-hmm. So they used a bunch of sprites for that. that whole fist here moves, so they used a bunch of sprites for that. And then, why doesn't undo work now? There we go. And then his eyes are sprites, and for some weird reason, even this like gold gem that's even the same color for some reason as his head.
Actually, I think his eyes are part of that top.
Oh, it's built into the tiles?
Palette.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they made that choice because of the meters, the life
Right.
meters on the left side that are, when you have 3 of them stacked up like that, you start running into issues once MegaMan gets up to that portion of the screen.
Right.
And there's something else up there, so.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. We saw that potentially that little gem with sprite, but I'm not sure why, because it's the same colors as his regular head.
And it was a good theory you had, like maybe it was just somehow better or more optimized for them to use the gem for collision detection. Like maybe there's bonus damage for hitting him there. I have no idea. I haven't played him so long, I don't remember.
Yeah, possibly.
You do have to jump up and hit him in that general region, right, with your shot?
Yeah.
Since the fist is blocking this part. And take a look at this, by the way. You mentioned the HUD. Remember, everyone, this is all sprites. So that's already massive risk for flicker. And then you've got this being a sprite. And I think this might be a sprite too. But if you notice, the jaw, which is like at least 4 sprites wide, you could see it's exactly below the HUD.
Mm-hmm.
So good thing for them. If the jaw were up higher, like if this character were taller like this, suddenly, even without MegaMan there'd be non-stop flicker going on.
And also with this guy, it's another example of with the floor.
Yes.
Instead of risking doing a screen slice that could cause a performance hit, they just decided we're going to make these horizontal lines.
Right.
And they're going to scroll with the tank, but you don't notice
tell.
it. It looks like the floor is still.
Right.
So, because MegaMan will stay still on the floor. So.
Exactly. I think he also shoot out other things that end up on the floor? I think like little hat enemies, basically. Like
the little hard hat guys come out of his chest, and he moves his fist up. That's why that has to be a sprite, because it moves up, and they come out, and
I guess they come out of this hole in his chest, theoretically.
Yeah, and it's interesting that if you play this boss fight and you're trying to jump up to that area,
right?
And there's also those little enemies coming out of his chest, along with his jaw and his fist being lifted up. Like it causes a massive amount of flicker.
Plus, you're probably shooting because you actually want to beat him and carry on with the game. So, it's just so. Like one of the things Corey and I was discussing the other night about this was this is a good example of. It's very likely they could have done the jaw opening and closing entirely with just animated tiles, but they probably ran out of tiles because the whole character, the whole boss, is so big and so organically drawn. There is some use of tiles down here, which is great. You've got this repeated 3 times or more. He's even bigger than this. And then you've got this tiled across and this tiles across once or twice. So that's all great, but all of this is all original tile work. And there's a little more, like there's an entire, I don't think we have it on the screenshot. 1 second.
Yeah, if you can, maybe if you want to pull up that sprite sheet that's got him on it.
Oh, right, yeah, I forgot.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. I think this is it. Yes.
Like a sprite.
So look how massive he is. And thank you very much to whoever made this sprite. A lot of times they put their name on it, but that's not the case here. So whoever did this, you know who you are, and thank you very much. If you care to comment in the video, we'd be happy to add thank you into the description of the video. But you can see how massive he is and how so much of this is freehand. So let's just say like they just hit the wall again. Like this is that difference of attitude. Are you going to just design the coolest freehand thing you can and then brute force it to work? Or are you going to say, okay, these are the limitations. How nice can I make it within these limitations? And then therefore end up with less flicker. So you've got like all these little sort of cable little lights and all this stuff.
Yeah,
Like that could have
totally
been
could have
tiled
been blacked
across
out
or
or
blacked
something.
out. Exactly. Like
Yeah.
blacked out would have been even more efficient. But then like did we really need this writing on the back of this guy? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that could have easily made, you know, I grabbed that very sloppily, but you know what I mean? Like that could have been a thing that tiled across a few times. And then another really costly thing, which was not that relevant, could have been this hose. And even if you're going to have it, would it really have been devastating to the overall quality of the design to have this part of the hose go straight up and then turn? You know what I mean? It could have been nice and
Well,
curved there.
and the thing about the writing back there in the hose is that
Right.
he's so large.
That's
he has
often
to
off
get
screen.
pretty far.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's often off screen. He has to get pretty far to the left,
Right.
for you to even notice that stuff.
Right.
Or even that little jet thing that's above the tank tread on the back,
Right.
which is. Looks nice, but I mean, you so rarely see it. It's
Right.
they could have went with something a little more efficient there to pull off the same look, but
Right. Yeah, so
and not to knock this guy. I mean, he
the
looks
design
great,
is
obviously,
fantastic. Yeah.
but
It came at
Yeah,
a cost of, because they needed to make that jaw out of sprites, and it's so wide across in its design, right?
mhm.
Because of those design decisions that were obviously made without the technical limitations in mind, you ended up with a game that plays fantastically and, on box art looks amazing. And then when you play it, like back then in the day, a lot of people were very much used to a lot of games on the Nintendo flickering. But when you compare like, Super Mario 3 or some other games where they were more careful about that, the level of the extended level of flickering was very obvious. And obviously in a high-speed action game like this, it can be a little detrimental to gameplay if you can't see your own shots, or maybe you can't even see well the projectiles coming from a boss or something. So it is something definitely to be careful of. And they definitely push the limits where their concern was definitely more on the overall design visually than they obviously were not worried very much at all about flicker. Like they just the dragon is another great example, but you could see that there was very little hit, and it was all to the back of this guy, and it freed up a lot of tiles, which certainly would have given them enough tiles to be able to have this jaw look exactly the same as it does in game, or virtually identical, because they obviously have that tile palette here. You can see black and the same exact two orange colors, or the orange and the highlight.
Mm-hmm.
So that tile palette exists, and it's the same thing in the face here. So that could have been animated tiles. And the other thing to keep in mind is, here he is without his jaw. Like, these are organic shapes, right? Like, yes, there was a couple of 8x8 blank pixels, but not many. They already were using up a lot of the tiles required for one of the jaw frames. And by that little tweak to the back there, they would have had enough tiles to have both frames for the jaw. And then that whole jaw could have looked exactly the same and still been animated, and not been sprites, which would have drastically reduced the number of flicker. So
It's interesting too how the tank treads doing the color cycling with the gray.
Yep.
Since they just kind of go back and forth, and he moves left and right, they're not moving any one particular direction.
Right.
They kind of pull off the same effect for him driving either way, which was clever. Right. However, they very well could have designed it in such a way to get rid of those red bits down there, right, and made it actually cycle one direction or the other, right, and had it go back and forth. It could have looked a little more dynamic, but right, I think that they compromised because they definitely wanted that red worked in just to tie it together a little bit.
Yeah, so, and that's the thing, like right here is the culprit. You can see one red. They didn't have that shadow red. That would be one too many colors. But the black that's in every tile palette, this red, so that they can have this go down in between the tank treads. And then both of the grays that color cycle that you need. So that's the same palette that's used here. And they didn't want to make the sacrifice. Like, they could have done this, right? And then this, And it's possible, like this might be an 8 pixel tile here, but that would be in the 16 by 16, so they would probably, they would have to have the same palette. But they could theoretically put a little bit of color cycling gray, just sort of machinery or lights. You know what I mean? That would have been fine to do the color cycling as well. And if they did that,
it definitely wouldn't have been an awful decision to do that. I don't think anyone would have, because most of your focus is on his upper body anyway. Right. So, but again, it's.
Well, I just wanted to visually show your point. Is they could have added a whole other gray to the cycling. So then that would have meant that it would have been a definitive illusion of the wheels and the treads going in a very specific direction, and then they could have reversed that color cycling step so that when he was going forward, the treads and the wheels that spin actually were going forward with that movement. And then when he written reverse, you reverse the direction of the color cycling, so it would have looked like it was actually reversing. So yeah, that's a great point, and it would have been a really clever use of color cycling to actually synchronize the illusion of movement with the actual scrolling horizontal movement of the boss. That would have been really cool. And the trade-off, as you saw, they just would have had to have tweaked the design so that metal part doesn't go down in between the treads, and so that red bit isn't there. And they could have even done like a central spoke detail, so long as it was designed in the way so that the fact that it changed color over time wasn't too distracting. So they would not have had to have lost much detail at all, and they would have gotten that really cool, very, very obviously turning in one direction or the other effect. So really good point. And then just to go back into the, like, look how freehand, look, beautiful design, beautiful art, great use of color, obviously not designed with the tile and sprite and color limitations as a high priority.
Right.
Like, it worked. They didn't over-design it so much that it was impossible to fit, but it requires so much compensation for the tiles. Like, if you look here, a piece of his eye is missing because they needed a tile for some reason with a different palette in the 16 by 16 grid. I guess that had the orange instead of the white. So that not only forces a lot of repeating redundant uses among several tile palettes, but now they need to use a sprite just to fix that eye. So there's an immediate increase to the likelihood of flicker. And to make matters worse, if you look, the dragon has wings. And the wings had to be sprites. Hold on, let me grab it with the right background color. So the wings had to be sprites too, and as you can see, that's quite a few sprites across. And you didn't just have the wings, but you also yet another sprite to fix that missing bit that couldn't be in the tiles. So there you have that again. And which, you can see...
Yeah, when you're fighting this guy, you see that little bit of his neck like
disappear all the time.
Flickering in and out constantly, and same with his face.
So look at this, though. You've got wing sprite, fixed sprite, eye sprite, all on the same level horizontally.
Yep.
That is going, like, that's already 1, 2, 3, 4. And then once you have MegaMan in a couple shots, and then this guy, like, breathes fire, doesn't he, or something?
Yeah, huge, fireballs.
So, oh, and he can go so high up that he is up on the screen with the 2 MegaMan meters and the enemy, the boss meter himself.
Yeah.
So at some points,
somewhere. Yeah, possibly. Maybe at least one.
I thought there was 2. I'm not seeing it at the moment, but I'm probably just not seeing it. Oh, I think we were going to do the video. Hold on a second. I think I have a URL.
Yeah, because we need to talk about how they transition into this. This boss.
Good point. Good point. All right, 1 second here. All right.
Despite this boss having a lot of flicker, and this is I think some sort of mod or something that is not going to.
Oh, this isn't the real one. Darn it! Okay. Hold on
yeah.
a second. Let me find the real one if I can. Hopefully, Mega Man 2 boss fights. Let's see. Mega Man 2 boss rush. Is this a real? Yeah, this looks like this has regular meters. So. Mega Man 2 all bosses. This seems even safer, especially since it was made 9 years ago.
Right.
Excellent. Okay. Although I think it's blurry, which luckily we don't have to really analyze the pixels in this case.
Right.
But here he is. And before we get into the dragon himself, this is pretty cool. Do you want to explain what's happening with the tile usage?
Yeah, they've got sort of the end of the level here, and they create tiles that sort of transition into this darker area, and it eventually becomes like a totally black place with these little platforms you have to jump on. And this is all tiles, including this here.
Right,
and then once you get to the individual blocks,
right? Once you're in this,
those become sprites, which is particularly why I think they, stepped them up at that one point.
Yep.
There.
Yep. So that they're doing this so that there's fewer per horizontal area to help avoid flicker, because each one of these is 2 sprites wide. So if they tried to do all 4 in a row, that would already be too many sprites, and you'd be getting flicker, even not counting Mega Man.
So, and then once you get to the boss himself, because he comes in and he's got this nice movement up and down. He's tiles, so the entire tile layer is scrolling around, basically.
Right, so that's the cool thing, is that here, as is normal, the environment is made out of the tiles. But they cleverly scroll off the entire environment and leave behind things that look exactly like the environment tiles that are now sprites carefully spread out. You just saw the corner of one disappear. So now they've got the background showing up again. They've swapped out the tiles, they swapped out the palettes so they could have the boss made out of the background. And because the platform tiles are sprites, you could see this horrendous level of flicker. The incredibly important... So this is where art design there was a massive price that they paid for gameplay, which you really need to strongly consider these choices. Like literally these 3 platforms are life and death. And for nearly a full second, all 3 of them were completely invisible.
Yep.
That is
they can
dangerous.
In and out.
So I don't know if I could refine that. There's Mega Man completely gone. The jaw is completely gone.
Yeah.
So,
and you see the meters coming in and out all the time too.
Right. Other critical information.
Yeah. So I mean, just
look at this.
That
all 3 platforms were gone, and the fire he's shooting at you was mostly all gone.
Yeah.
So like this is one of those cases where clearly the priority was just get the coolest, biggest, freehand, most colorful stuff, and we will make it work. Design it first, and we'll make the hardware display it, even at the cost of the fact that the hardware is only displaying it half the time. And that could be really detrimentally bad for gameplay. But I remember playing this game and loving it, and pretty much not noticing. Like I said, back then we were kind of used to a lot of flicker.
Yeah, but, we adjusted to that sort of thing. We knew it, but
it was unnecessary. Sorry about that. I should have given a epilepsy warning there. They did not think about such things back then.
Right.
Like they just don't do that in game design anymore. The flashing, flashing stuff. But yeah. So that's one of those cases. Corey and I are going to probably be hitting on this point in every one of these forensic Pixology videos, at least for the 8-bit era. Like where there was this nonstop tug of war of the graphical limitations of the device and what they wanted to pull off. And very often you were going to get either the price was going to be massive flickering or a very bad frame rate, or other issues just not having enough frames of animation for something. So you have something nice and big, but its movement is really, really choppy, or it doesn't move at all. It just slides around. So those are the kind of trade-offs that you have to really decide what's more important.
Yeah, and they to get at least outside the realm of the bosses for a second, like
Yep.
the barriers that you can blow through that with the crash bombs.
Yep. Do you have a screen for that, or?
I think there might be a screen.
All right. If not, I should close this folder. We don't need it. All right. Let's see.
I believe if you go to, let's see, which one is it? Oh yeah. Okay. They're labeled barriers 1 and 2.
There we go.
So,
okay, I'll load up the first one.
Forgot what I named them.
Yep.
Okay, so this is a clear example of, you can see the very, very tip top of MegaMan's head up there.
I didn't even notice he was on screen.
Exactly. So they've got the sprite of the E-Tank back there,
which
and
is
then
already 2 sprites wide.
Right, and then the meters on the left-hand side. And for whatever reason, even though they could have done it with tiles, they decided to make these barriers out of sprites. And they're 2 sprites wide, and there were plenty of cases where they put multiple barriers in a row to have to get through as a design decision.
Right. Just massive flicker, yeah.
I know it's because they were trying to reserve all of the available colors for the level itself.
Right. But on this particular screen, it looks like they're only using 2 tile palettes.
Yeah, and
Am I wrong? Like, there's the background, and then there's this. Those are the only 2 I see anywhere on this screen. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed in this whole game, as you go through the levels, they don't, with the exception of, I guess, maybe the title screen where they swap out the palettes for the logo.
Right.
Within the gameplay levels, they reserve the 4 palettes for the entirety of the level.
Right.
With the exception of, I think, Crashman's stage, you reach a point, the sky is blue, and then you reach a point where it shifts to black.
Right.
And it's just a quick little change for the second half of the level.
Right.
Which is not a huge thing, but yeah, they pretty much don't do any clever, like, swapping out the colors between areas, even though they could have to get a lot more color out of this game. They didn't bother,
in this case, in this area, it would have made absolute perfect sense. Like, literally, they're only using 2 tiles, and there's nothing else going on that requires other tile palettes. So they could have easily just made these tiles and had that as one of the tile palettes. And then there would have been no flicker in this level instead of a bunch. Or in this or in this section of a level, I should say. And remember, like, people watching, like, you can swap palettes on the fly, no problem at all. So it's pretty crazy they didn't do it. Like, maybe there's some kind of technical reason they didn't that I can't think of or don't know about.
I think the general reason for it is because every time you transition to a new portion of the map in this game, you always scroll the screen.
Right.
And they probably didn't want any jarring issues with maybe you see a new color all of a sudden.
Pop
so you have to see the portion of the last screen scroll away, you know. Which and this is a side note of a different game, but if you notice in Metroid 1, that is exactly why you have those little transition tunnels.
Right, so they can swap out
very
palettes.
Low color. They're swapping out the color palette for the next area in that screen because they do the screen scroll. So they want to make sure you don't see that transition. Very clever game, although it's not the prettiest game, but very... again, this was Nintendo making that game. But anyway, that's a different game. But,
that's great points. All right. So shall we move on to another screen?
Yeah, if you want to... They do some clever color cycling in this game. I know we already mentioned the tank treads of the guy there.
Right.
But if you want to bring up that animated promotion file, the water animation file, toward the end.
Animation.
I've got the 3 frames here of the cycling animation, and this is all. It looks like animated tiles, but it's not. They are just cycling those colors. They have to do sort of a dark to light color transition, and then immediately shift from the light color back to the dark color below that in the design of the tile.
So just to make this more easier to understand, I should say.
Yeah, exactly.
I will move this color over here. I said I'll move it. Oh, I selected 2. Oops. This is the first time I've ever used ProMotion, I swear. Okay, and then there. Yeah, so we've got these 3 colors, right? So what's happening, just like with the tank treads that only were shifting 2 colors, what's happening is it's going to move this dark blue to where the white is. It's going to move the white to where the medium blue is, and it's going to move the medium blue. So it's literally shifting them over to the right, and the one that's rightmost gets moved back to the first position, which is currently where the white is. So they're cycling through, hence the expression color cycling. Right. And so it's really effective. Oh, I messed up the other things while I was remapping. But so here it is. So it's really hard to tell, but if we focus on a particular shape, so let's look at this shape here, and let's fill it with a different color. So let's, I'm going to, oops, one moment, isolated fill, and make sure I'm actually selecting a color, and we are going to fill that color, that section, where was it? It's a nice isolated shape. So now we can look and see on every frame, you could see that shape stays exactly the same, and that's true for all of the art of the water. So it's a perfect illusion of, or near perfect illusion of movement, not needing any new memory aside from that tiny, tiny little bit of code that says, hey, shift these colors every few portions of a second, you know, like cycle these colors. It's incredibly efficient. It takes way less processing power and way less memory, and you can animate the entire screen. And there is, I don't think we have any screen grabs of it, but there's that entire level that's like in the clouds. What's that boss's name? Is it Cloud Man or Wind Man or whatever?
Airman.
Airman. Yeah. So there's like, and the other cool thing, it's very rare on the Nintendo that they put use to the fact that you can have sprites go behind tile graphics.
Oh yeah,
so
there's.
You have these clouds that are overlapping other stuff, you know, including MegaMan, and or just specifically overlapping any sprite, including MegaMan. And the cool thing is they have these edge colors, these fairly soft pastel-y colors, considering the 8-bit Nintendo's palette. And they're just doing a different kind of more subtle color cycling, bouncing back and forth. To, like, otherwise those clouds would have seemed far too static and far too solid. But just the fact that they make the edge kind of fluctuate with this little color cycle just gives it such a nice feeling of softness that in movement in general that just really does just works beautifully. Let's see. Back to the screens. What screen would you like to talk about next?
And just as another to drive home the color cycling, it doesn't always have to be. You know, you can use it for different things. There was, I think, in Heatman's level, there's like a lava kind of river thing going on down there, and it's not animated in the image we have, but it's just another example of them setting it up. They reserved a palette just for that lava, and it's got the same effect, and it just does like a horizontal scroll.
Right.
Or it seems to. It's the illusion of it.
So by setting up the art in a specific way and making sure your palette ranges from light to dark, and you set up the shapes so that when you cycle those colors, it creates, in this case, it creates the illusion of horizontal movement, but obviously, like with the waterfalls, it was vertical. And any way you make those shapes, so if you have alternating colors like that, and you have, for example, you could make the illusion of diagonal movement by creating shapes sort of like this, and then you would just repeat that shape over and over again,
Yep.
And obviously you would want it to fit in tiles, not like this giant art, but you get the idea. And it would really feel like that was just flowing upward on a upward left diagonal movement.
Yep, and it's pretty much the same effect as the water, a flow.
Right.
But as you can see with the tank treads, you can use it in a different way. And I think there was like a fan, this giant fan.
Yeah.
Image. I think if you want to open that real quick, which was a very different example, but worth bringing up. This thing, if you cycle through the 3 frames there, it looks like it's moving one direction. But you can tell it's just black and one other color.
Right.
I think they're doing some very, very clever swapping out of colors here to make it look like this thing is rotating.
Right. Hence why it's only 2 colors. They needed to reserve those other 2 colors to secretly hide the other frames of animation built into this one thing. So we didn't have time to set up like a simple example. But to give you the idea, so let's say there's this hidden color that's part of the cycle that continues the art for the next frame of movement, right? So that's one of the other colors that's necessary. But then the other hidden color, we'll make this like a purple color or something. The other hidden color is a color that overlaps the 2 and is the sort of difference between those things. So when you carefully change this color that's currently completely hidden in black, and you change this purple color that's currently hidden to be the same as this color, now you can create this in-between shape. So it's very sophisticated way to fit a 3-frame animation into basically 3 color tiles, 3 color plus black. It requires a very tricky technique and some patience to pull it off. But as you can see, it was a fantastic way to get very large moving objects on screen in the environment using very, very little memory.
Yeah, the main reason I had that suspicion that it was color cycling is because they're so large.
Yeah.
They would have had to reserve way too many tiles to animate all of those.
Right. They wouldn't have had tiles left over for the rest of the environment if they were just trying to do something that large purely with the animated tiles for these 3 frames. Yep. But you can see that just because they wanted these, they are not using as many tiles as otherwise would be the case in an environment. You can see that's like one repeating pattern here, which is maybe 4x4 tiles or whatever, and then like there's the top, and then there's this one pattern in the background. So they clearly had a vision for having these big moving gears for this environment, and the price they had to pay was a more repetitive environment otherwise.
Yep. And I think that pretty much covers all of the little color cycling tricks, which was admittedly much more sophisticated than anything we saw in Mario 3.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
They did it in a few little places in Mario 3, but not nearly as much.
Right.
Well, one example in Mario 3 would have been the star power on Mario, which we didn't mention. They're just kind of like going crazy with the palette colors.
Right. Good point. Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to mention, which I brought up in the last video, was this idea that, if you draw a box or a text box or something, it has to be drawn with tiles. Otherwise, unless you make it small enough to be drawn with sprites. And the perfect example are those 2 screenshots of this box, which obviously, they made that compromise of it's colored with the palettes of the environment. So whatever level you're in, this box is a different color. And also, if you look at the second screenshot,
hold on, I'm gonna try to line these up so it's more obvious.
Yeah.
It might be tough. Hold on a second. I'm gonna get rid of this too, so I don't keep it accidentally.
You might could paste it into the same frame or something.
I've got a lot of stuff open here. That's a good point.
Like that might
be faster.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, I'll make that a transparent color. Go to this one, paste it down, and then I can just use undo. Oops, that's not undo here. There we go. There we go. So you can see, because the screen was scrolled over a little bit differently horizontally,
Yep.
now when this box appears, it must be in a slightly different position as well.
Yep, and it stays in the general same spot, and no one ever really notices that it shifts a little bit, but
Right.
that's just a perfect example
Right.
of why certain games were designed
Right.
the way they were.
Right. It's always going to be within a 16 pixel horizontal range, because the way the
Right.
Nintendo must work is that it's divided into 16 by 16, or I should say, 16 by 16 pixel grid as far as color palettes. So in order for this to be able to definitely use its proper color palette, it has to properly fit in that 16 by 16 pixel grid. But since the screen scrolls, that 16 by 16 pixel grid is going to be within a 16 pixel variant shift at any given time. So their two options were either do a fairly jarring quick camera scroll to adjust the grid so that this box always appears in the exact same spot on screen, or just do that compromise and use clever coding to say, okay, we're always going to figure out, based on the scrolling, where the closest 16 by 16 grid is to display the box, and that's what they went with, and I think it was a really smart choice.
Mm-hmm.
But as you can see, it definitely, if you pop a screen back and forth, you can really see that it's quite far over, in quite a different position.
Yeah, and also,
Yep.
I suppose it might be worth going over a couple of really nicely made screens in this game. One would be the level select screen, which I think
Right.
I have a PSD in there for.
Yeah, I'll load that up. Oh, it's over here. Okay.
Definitely worth talking about this, as it's so iconic.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I always remembered it being very clean and relatively colorful for the 8-bit Nintendo. Sorry, I'm just having trouble spotting it on my... Hold on a second. So I dragged it onto the screen so you can see too. Am I missing it? Did it disappear from the folder?
It's right there, the PSD MegaMan 2 level select.psd.
Oh, it's a PSD. That's why. Okay, I forgot it was a PSD. That's why. Level select. Yeah. No, there's good reasons. I'm really grateful that you took the time to make a layered PSD so we can really see what they're doing here. Mm-hmm. All right, so let me zoom in. There we go.
Yeah, so they had to cram these nice portraits in with lots of color.
Right. So obviously they needed to use tiles as much as possible.
Yep. And extra sprites to add the extra bits of color they needed.
Right.
So if you go to if you disable that sprite layer, you can see all the skin tones and a lot of their eyes are these sprites.
Right. So that's how they got the extra color in each portrait. This is what the actual tiles look like for this level select. And they very nicely use sprites to add that bit of extra color. Mm-hmm. And then, yep.
And if you pull up the color palettes there, which I separated...
yeah, that's awesome.
Bubble Man and Woodman's portraits use their own unique tile palette. Interestingly enough, everything else on the screen, all of the other portraits are just two tile palettes. The strange,
right.
Purplish red with with that little kind of muddy yellow color.
Greenish gold, yeah.
Greenish gold. There aren't really great yellows in the NES palette, but
right.
And then that blue palette, and it's amazingly enough, it was enough with the extra sprite colors to really splash a really great screen. And of course, they repeated this methodology
across every game in the franchise.
Game. Yeah, they pretty much used the exact same layout and everything.
Right.
And because it worked so well.
Right, and I think you mentioned the actual game sprite of Crashman is more of a rusty red.
Right.
But they couldn't spare another palette, so the compromise was, well, it's a dark reddish color, so this reddish purple will suffice.
Right.
And I think it was it was a good choice. Like, it's just so clean, and overall each portrait is just really pretty and endearing and captures the character very nicely. So yeah, really nice stuff.
And then another really nice piece of art in the game, which is a good example of very clever tile usage, is Wily's castle there.
This is going back to that whole freehand thing, and
this is a great example though of how you got to think you have a 128 by 128 pixel section of background tiles, and they were able to repeat enough areas here to make this look like a nice full screen image. Right.
People can easily get lost in numbers. Keep in mind, everyone, what Corey is saying is there is nowhere near enough visual memory for tiles on the 8-bit Nintendo to literally display even a single full screen of art. It's literally impossible.
It's barely more than a quarter of the screen size, basically. Let me put it that way.
So whenever you see something that looks like a hand-drawn full-screen image on the 8-bit Nintendo, keep in mind an artist worked hard to create the illusion of a full-screen hand-drawn graphic using roughly the art equivalent of a quarter of the screen. So that's a really good non-numerical way to get that point across. They had to fit all of the information for that image had to fit in the area I scribbled, basically.
Yep. And I there may be a few. I think maybe the little W on his on the skull there is probably a sprite. But other than that, I don't know if there are too many extra sprites. He's maybe a handful here and there. Right.
Like maybe this rocket tip because it has bright white, and the purple, but I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but it's very well done. Lots of little areas where they, transition areas where you would think they couldn't have pulled it off, that they were able to do with some sharp angles and stuff.
Like down here.
Very interestingly done. But
and if you really look carefully, like there's so much like wonderfully sort of hidden reuse. Like, that's some pretty heavy reuse, but the art was drawn carefully enough that it works really well. And then they've got, like, these couple of tiles to transition from the surface high-lit area of that stone surface to transition down into the black, so they could get away with covering large areas of the screen with just a nice, clear black tile. They did the same thing with the sky. You've got the solid single blue tile, solid single black tile, and then just a few tiles, I think literally 2 tiles, maybe, I guess 3, at the most, and then just using those tiles over and over again to create this circular gradation from the blue to the black. Similar thing for the stone, and just beautifully, beautifully done. And it really feels, and again, like you could tell the Capcom, the sort of modus operandi or their disposition was do really nice big full screen art and then just wrestle with the limitations to get it to work. And in the case of a static screen where you don't have to worry about flicker and you don't have to use a lot of sprites, you can definitely make it work. But obviously the artist had to be much more careful with the optimizing to pull this off.
Yep.
Really nice stuff.
And if you want, I didn't know if you wanted to mention like the star effect of the.
Oh yeah, sure.
It's not a huge thing to talk about, but I guess if you pull up that that screenshot there, these stars look like they're scrolling at different speeds
horizontally.
And I think the very back is the very back layer of stars, the tiniest stars, are just tiles that are scrolling
speed. Right. So keep in mind, if you look at this, perfectly straight lines horizontally that go across the whole screen. So, because this is a sprite, you wouldn't see him moving anyway. Like, he could stay put wherever you want. So it would create the illusion that this whole area is static. The big question mark is text is almost always tiles. And that might be 8 sprites across. How wide is this? 64. So that is exactly 8 sprites, isn't it? So theoretically, they could have made that out of sprites because there would be no flicker because there's no other sprites in that region.
It's very much a possibility. I suppose it's possible they could have done some screen slicing, but
Right.
and they might have done that in later Mega Man games because they actually have a lot of detail around the character here.
Right.
But it could have gone either way here,
Right?
Because they have enough. But what they did is for the larger stars, that have this sort of parallax effect. They are all drawn individually with sprites. There's just they kept the number of them down low enough to where total sprites on screen had to be less than or equal to 64. Right. And anytime you see that type of star effect on the NES, it's pretty much created the same way. So most of the time.
Right. Yeah, they had very, very little other options to be able to pull off a full screen effect of a bunch of small moving objects. Of course, you could do it with, if they were moving super fast, you could get away with having animated tiles. You know what I mean?
That's true, yeah.
But that is not the case in this case. At least I don't think so. I think it scrolled too smoothly, and there were too many variations because, as we said, the different size stars were moving at different speeds. Excuse me. And is this used in an actual level at some point, or just another cinematic scene? I know it's used in some kind of other scene beside this, but I don't remember what that was.
I think it's the very, very final fight.
Oh, that techno. Do I still have that video open? Yes.
Yeah. If you want to get to the end there.
Yeah. Epilepsy warning, everyone. This is like ridiculously full of flashes and stuff, so...
Yeah, he morphs into this weird alien, which is probably one of the strangest things that happens in a Mega Man game, to be honest with you.
Yeah, actually.
And they put these stars back there, and they're doing the same effect, so they are really overloading sprites here. Very little flicker, amazingly enough, going on.
It just so happens that this player knows strategically that the most effective weapon against him is this bubble, and you don't rapid fire the bubble shot. And he was loading it right into him. So you can see they're still continuing with the same sprites to keep that star effect, but now we've got like a disco ball type thing going on. And, wow, I just noticed that in order to get the lighting this organic, again, this freehand drawing versus building it around the limitations, they didn't just use flip tiles to create this on the other side. Like, if you look at the spacing... Like here, there's a big black space and then a big white highlight. Oops, sorry about that. I should pause it. So, like, the 8-bit Nintendo, if I recall, it can horizontally flip tiles, right?
Actually, I don't think it can.
Oh, maybe it can. Oh, I'm thinking of the Master System.
Yeah, the Master System can, but the NES can flip sprites but not tiles. Right.
The Master System is the opposite, which is really interesting. Okay. Yeah, never mind then. They couldn't have gotten away with flipping it in the first place.
It's still a really large...
Yeah. That's a lot of tiles for that.
It's a decent amount of tiles that they decided they wanted this screen, Yep. And, I mean, that thing, it could have been way smaller, and they got away with it, But
in this case, they only otherwise needed... the
edges,
the perimeter. So they didn't need a lot of tiles for the overall environment art. So they spent a giant chunk of them on this device. Obviously, all this black in here is just one tile, except for where the black meets these curves. So it's still a lot of tiles. I am wondering how they pulled off this background. Is this the original 8-bit Nintendo? Do you remember? Did you play it recently and get to this point?
I think it's
that looks like too many colors. It's artifacting?
Yeah, I think it's just artifacts of the video. Yeah, okay. I do think it's just a 3-color background.
Right. Well, black, white, and then 2 blues, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I think so.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just the smudginess of the...
Yeah, very blurry video. creating lots of extra
quality.
colors. Okay.
And now, if you want, we can take a look at a couple of maybe bad pieces of art. There's the poorly drawn fish, which is
perfectly named. Perfectly named file.
And I saw this, and this fish is only in this one portion of this level in the game, and you don't see it very. It's very fast,
Right,
so
it
you
just
don't
comes
really
up
get a
from the
good look
bottom
at it.
and then falls
But when you
back
see
down.
it in isolation, I mean that does not at all
Match
seem
the
to fit
quality
the style
right.
or quality of the game in
Right.
general, considering how great the illustrative qualities of some of these other enemies are.
And keep in mind, everyone, like, we are massive Mega Man, Capcom fans and Mega Man fans in general.
Oh, yeah.
And overall, the art quality of this game is superb. So that's why I'm laughing. It's not because, haha, look at these guys, they suck. It's because of how out of place this fish is.
Right.
And in its art quality and style, the rendering style, it looks far less like they were trying to worry about it looking really three-dimensional. It looks very much more like a child's drawing. And this is a fun point to bring up. We mentioned this before, that when people were making these games, they were under massive technical constraints and time constraints. And it very well could be that when they were designing this level, they only had like an intern or entry-level artist available, and like the designer was like, I want a really big fish to come up from the bottom of the screen and chomp at Mega Man in this area, and they had him do what they thought would be placeholder art. And basically they either ran out of time or forgot, or they decided it wasn't important enough. Maybe it grew on them. Maybe they thought it was charming, that it looked like a child's drawing. But at any point, this kind of stuff can happen, even in a AAA quality game. In fact, personal anecdote, one of the first, big movie franchise games I got to work on was a Batman title for mobile. And all kinds of things can happen that can just make bad art end up in the final game, or it can make good art suddenly seem bad. And in my case, I had... This is what happens when there can be a communication gap between the programmer making the actual animations display and interact in the actual game mechanics and the artist that was designing this particular animation under a different assumption of how the movement was going to happen. So anyway, I made Batman do what was supposed to be a cool, like simultaneously lunge forward, sort of hop in the air and come down with like a blackjack move to knock out an opponent in one hit from behind, right? Mm-hmm. The problem was the way the programmer programmed it, Batman just like did some kind of anti-gravity slide across the floor. Mm-hmm. So there was this massive miscommunication of what was supposed to happen. And by the time I saw, even though I was mortified, by the time I saw the thing incorporated into the game was ready to ship. There was no time to talk to the programmer and get him to adjust the physics, or allow me to adjust the animation. Now that I saw how he implemented the physics, I could have tweaked the animation to work and look the way it was supposed to work. But basically, it made what was supposed to look like a cool ninja-type move look like ridiculously soft and ineffective and silly.
Yeah, and it's the sort of thing that's going to creep right past like the QA people,
right?
Because they're not really looking for that. Like
they're looking for crashes.
They're not going to see things that
right.
were unintentional or might have been a mistake,
right?
And it's just going to slip right past them, and they're not going to report it. Nobody's going to say anything about it. This is why it's always worth the actual developers,
right?
If you can afford the time to, what may seem to be the finished product, give it some really good. Testing yourself to some extent, or at least have a look at everything that's supposed to be finalized to make sure there might be some final polish tweaks or things you need to make.
I heard great stories of the same thing happening on 3D titles back in the 3DO day. there's a legendarily bad game, and there was the same situation. The artists were animating something with a certain assumption, and the programmer programmed it in a completely different way, and you ended up with a character that was sort of doing this anti-gravity slide across the floor instead of jumping and stuff and that ended up shipping. Like, that just ended up. So all of you artists out there that are in the industry or going to get in the industry or want to someday, keep that in mind. Do your best to force the programmers to show you the stuff, the art you're doing, once it's actually in the game. So that you hopefully have time to say, hey, I pictured you making it, have this upward velocity or gravity or something. Or, now that I know how you're doing it, give me some time to tweak the animation so that it works well together with what you did. Because, let me tell you something, a lot of times when you see something that just genuinely looks like a bad artist or a bad team made something happen in a game, very often there were circumstances completely outside the standards and ability of the team that just ended up shipping in the game, and they may be every bit as aware and embarrassed of that particular thing as you might find it. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's always good if you're working with a programmer consistently, to develop that good relationship with them, where maybe, to convey your ideas, you might have to throw together some animations or animated GIFs or just something to convey exactly how things are supposed to look.
That is a great suggestion. A great suggestion when you're delivering new art, especially for a complicated movement or something important in the game that you really want to come across as badass. Don't just provide the final assets for the character. Actually take the time to make a mock-up of a game screen and actually animate it so that they can see exactly how that movement is supposed to, how you envision it to work. So then the programmer kind of has no excuse, or far less of an excuse to sort of incorporate it in a lazy way and then just not care that it just looks ridiculous. So. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, sometimes, most of the time in the game industry, you'll run into programmers that really care and are hyper dedicated to quality, and every once in a while you'll run into a remarkably lazy programmer with low standards that somehow is still surviving in the industry. So it does happen.
Of course, yeah, you get people of all types.
Yep.
No matter where you go.
So the more clearly you can communicate what is supposed to be, how the art is supposed to be incorporated, the better, and the better the game will be when it ships. So, all right, that's it for the fish guy. I think there was one other minor thing that I had. We didn't talk about that level, and that's another really nice use of palette shifting or color cycling. So I'll just load this image up quickly. And this also shows that whole menu box is very different colors. You remember it was kind of reddish magenta hues in that other level, but because this is made out of tiles, it has to use one or more of the environment tiles. So the choice they could make is, do we want to dedicate one of the 4 palette tiles to make sure, which was the decision they made in Mario, right?
Right.
The UI was always the same color, right? Across any environment. So they made the opposite sacrifice. They said, we want the UI to be consistent always. So they sacrificed, they said, okay, well, one of the tile colors, palettes, needs to be the same. You could still use it in the environments, but it's going to be those colors. Whereas the MegaMan team said, no, we want to be able to change all 4 tile palettes for any level to make each level more distinct. But the price was, now the UI is going to change color in any given level. So you've got less familiarity, less of that sense of polish in that regard. But now the environments can be more distinctly colorful.
And they did change the style of this pop-up box for the various games. I think in Mega Man 3 they actually
do a screen size at the bottom, and it comes up from the bottom. It's
Wow.
like a little smooth transition.
Yeah, I don't
and,
even remember that. Wow.
which was very different.
Yeah.
I mean, it works exactly the same, but it's just all down to choice.
Right.
I think this version only exists in the first 2 games,
Right.
and then they decided to change it after that. And I don't think it necessarily has to do with the tile shifting, but there was some reason they wanted to alter it. And then, of course, it eventually became just a full sub-screen in later games, where they had to display more information. They probably needed to reserve some special colors or tiles just for that screen. So,
another thing interesting about this is the fact that they get rid of all on-screen sprites when they open this. Like, obviously, this Mega Man had his sprites. It would amaze me, but I have a feeling, wouldn't it be crazy? Is this 64 pixels? Did they use sprites for the HUD? For the meters?
Did. Yeah, I think
they did. Wow. Like, they could have done that with tiles, but then again, if they didn't have that white color, I mean, I assume they have white and black and then the blue background in the top, one of the tile palettes for,
for
the
text.
For the text. But
well, I don't know if you look though.
Yeah.
See, if you look, they're offset on the tiles, right? You see how the side of the tiles, they're offset by 4 pixels, the font and the meters. So yeah, the font, everything within the box basically is sprites.
Wow.
So,
that's
surprising.
shocking.
I think that's exactly why they made Mega Man and everything on screen disappear.
They needed all of the sprites, and that's got to be so close to the full 64. You've got like basically 8 here, 8, 16, 24, 32. They're getting used up fast. And then this is a colorful, 2 sprites. And what were they 8 by 8 was the limit?
What do you mean?
Like every sprite was 8 by 8. So you could have 64 sprites, but they were only 8 by 8. So this is 4 sprites. Period. Just this head alone. So yeah, that's why they had to get rid of all the sprites when the menu came up.
And they could have.
Yep, go ahead.
I mean, they could have worked that font in. I would say most levels have at least a white and black version of a tile.
Right.
But it could have had to do with the color they needed in the background of the box itself, whatever they chose. Maybe it clashed with the palette that they reserved the white in the environment. So like they made a compromise, so.
Right. Yeah, so really interesting choices. Yeah, exactly. And then the reason I loaded this in the first place was you can see the art for these tiles is identical, right? But they're using different palettes, and then on top of that, they're swapping the entire tile palettes for those tiles so that you're getting these light ones alternate position with these dark ones. Like every second or few seconds or something. So it's a really nice, cool effect, and it's extremely efficient on memory. You're just swapping out those palettes.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's.
And then I think.
Anything else for this screen, or should I close it?
I think that's fine for that screen. I think the one thing you brought up earlier that we didn't touch on was that image of Mega Man on the power-up screen.
Yep.
That you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, so again, like there's very, very, very little to fault in the actual art, aside from the fish. There was, and even that, it's not like it's horrendously bad. I mean, it's the shape of a fish and everything. It's just not up to the same quality. It's not as cool looking, and it's not colored in a way to emulate cell shading. Like its highlight is even on the seemingly opposite side. It just seems out of place. It seems like it was made by a different person than the usual artists on this game, and it seems like it was sort of rushed. It almost looks like a scribble.
Right.
But the only other thing that I can actually suggest literal edits to, in my opinion, improve, and I'll explain why when I can find these screens. Boy, I'm so bad at this. Here they are. All right, so this, I think, is the original. This is how it appeared in the actual game. Mm-hmm. And then here is my suggested edit. There we go. So let me try to get them roughly aligned. And I think I'm going to follow your advice and do the same thing because it's quicker. So I'll pick a background color, turn grid on, grab this, switch over. All right, let's see.
And if you, I was about to say, you could paste that into a new animation frame.
Oh, that's true too. So
or layer,
Right, right. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I'll do a layer. Add a layer, and
that way, just in case, just in case it gets lost. But
right.
yeah.
Let's see. So I think hold on. I think I have the wrong one though. That's the problem. Oh no, that's good. Okay. So I'm going to put this one on this layer. What did I do?
I think that it's using that white color as the transparent.
Oh, even though I grabbed it differently, that's weird. All right, well, let's try that again. So we need this one. There we go. Oh, that's really weird. Yeah, the guess part is wrong. There we go. Okay. Now we're cooking. There we go. Thank you, Corey.
All right.
All right, so the proportions of this are just bizarre no matter what. Like, we know that MegaMan otherwise is portrayed in a chibi style where the head is very big compared to the body, which is fine, and obviously they wanted to move away from that chibi style. Like, like if you think of games like the Final Fantasy series on the 8-bit Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, when they show the character portraits, they're not chibi, or like during the combat scenes. Well, in later games, they're not chibi, but then when you're walking around, it's the chibi style with the big head. That's all fine, but like when they were going for the slightly less chibi proportions, they did not find a nice balance between normal human proportions and chibi proportions. And in particular, the arms are really bizarrely short. In general, like the classical art, like Greek canon of figure drawing, if you want a human figure to look very elegant, or at least normal, the wrists are going to, like if the arms are down by the side, the wrists are going to align with the crotch. So that was one of the changes I made is, oops, I just hide this layer. I moved down the wrists, and I also, you could see that torso was really short, and then the legs are oddly long. Especially the lower
about
legs.
his pelvis and like his upper legs look really kind of bulgy when they don't
puffy.
need to be. When you can see in the later iterations of the MegaMan design, like he doesnn't have that. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like he's got very thin legs. And
arms. To be as to be as mean as possible about it, it kind of feels like he's like a misshapen toddler in puffy like underoos and pajamas. You know what I mean? Or even like a red diaper. Like this is like rounded and puffy on the sides here, which doesn't help. And then like the legs are a little bloated, the upper thighs, and then the torso is so short. It's just, it's very sort of unelegant proportions. And so that would have been my suggestion to edit it to look a little more toward a typical canon of a human being.
Or
and
we
still have the chibiness of the big head, but it's just more balanced now and less puffy.
Or even if you wanted to go with the original arms, like those boots are just they just look too big. Like his legs overall look a little too tall.
Yeah.
By comparison,
like look how much
shorten
better.
them down and thin them up just a little bit. It might work with those arms,
a couple of pixels shorter, and look how much better that looks.
Right, exactly. Just a couple of pixels,
Yeah.
But and this isn't a gigantic critique. I mean, it does look like MegaMan. It's just, it's a little minor thing. Worth pointing out, I think.
Yeah, we wanted to be fair, and if there was something that we could give useful critique for, like just for people, keep that in mind. It's really important if you're going to be drawing humanoid figures and you want them to look heroic and elegant. It's really good to know that general canon of, generally you want the crotch to be like the halfway point, which this pretty much is, but the way they did that was shorten the torso and have make room for the giant head. But then, which was kind of a mistake if you're going to go for the chibi proportions.
You could also even say, and this is something I didn't notice before, but like the head, he feels like he just kind of doesn't have a neck either.
Right.
Like if the head was, if the head was up just a little bit, or his shoulders down, or something like that, might look a little better too.
Right. It's almost like they were going for a very slight overhead angle, which is reflected a tiny bit in the feet.
Right.
And I guess the way the shadow has perspective on it, it's not like a single line, or like you could see the shadow. So there's a very slight overhead effect on it, but not enough to warrant like his head going up a little bit would make it even more. He does seem like his head is kind of compressed down into his torso too much.
Yeah, maybe just a slight bit. It probably wouldn't need
pixel
to
or
be
two.
Much.
Yeah.
But and if you look at the later games, I mean, they improved this portrait by a ton. Like he's in a nice pose. I think even
and the proportions are much better. Right.
Yeah. So they improved it as they kept fleshing out the design of MegaMan himself throughout the series. I mean, that's the thing to remember is, they have a general character design in their first games of most of these series, but they, it took how
it gets
long
refined
until Mario looked like he looked, you know what I mean?
Right.
I remember Mario specifically for a while having like the red overalls versus the blue. They eventually decided on the blue and stuck with it.
Right.
And, it's fun to go back and look at those
changes over time. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So that's it for that one. I think. Let's see. We're getting really close to the end. I think for this. We could talk really quickly. Here's one of the final boss fights. I think. Why doesn't
the Wily ship or machine or whatever it is?
Yeah. So this is another circumstance where every blue element was sprites. Mm-hmm. So again, you ended up with this thing can shoot quite a bit, and of course, MegaMan is shooting as much as he can. This entire blue dome is sprites, which is going to overlap with these HUDs, these health bars or meters, I should say. So you're just going to end up with a lot of flicker pretty consistently.
And they almost, and this is another case of where they needlessly put a weird propeller on the very back.
Yeah.
That's also blue, and they could have just done like some animated like
tiles.
Jets or something, tile jets or something back there that would have had the same effect, and it almost looked more technologically advanced than a propeller.
Here's a question for you. You played this more recently than me?
Mm-hmm.
Does this whole thing move horizontally and vertically?
I don't think so. I think it only
just horizontally.
Yeah.
Okay, because I was going to say then they would have needed to use screen slicing here.
Right.
And then if they did use screen slicing, then they could have had a detailed floor that wouldn't have to worry about synchronizing the scrolling. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it could have scrolled on its own however they wanted. But that does make me think they even had blue, white, and black palette, so they could have done animated tiles for that propeller, and it could have looked very, very similar. So it would have looked basically like this as a worst case scenario. And they could have easily, like, why did they bother making the floor that bright? It just goes to show you they had a tile palette available to do blues and blacks.
Yep.
So they could have drastically reduced, they could have gotten in a lot of this accenting if they had been a little more careful with their tile usage. But anyway, so...
And again, like, visually, it's a great design. Like, it looks cool. It looks really cool. But, yeah, especially I think there's a point where you shoot it enough and, like, it opens up and Dr. Wily's actually sitting there. Like, he's visible.
Right, he's exposed here in the cockpit.
And so that adds even more sprites to that area there that you're literally shooting at, and it's got this...
So in this one spot, MegaMan is going to be jumping up there all the time, and he has 3 to 4 sprites wide. And plus his face is a separate sprite. So that's like 4 to 5 sprites. He's going to be shooting. That's at least 2 sprites. Then you've got an at least 2 sprite wide Dr. Wily. Then you've got a 2 sprite wide thing here, and then you've got this propeller for no good reason that could have easily been animated tiles.
Right.
So in the critical area where you want to be able to see what you're shooting at and MegaMan and your shots, and of course keep in mind, like, he's shooting his own stuff too. I don't know, sometimes something dangerous must appear up here as well to threaten MegaMan.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have been hard for them to have designed it worse as far as forcing, and I don't mean this aesthetically, they were really good artists, but you could see the difference in approach and attitude with the Mario team going, okay, let's be mindful of these and let's just make things as nice looking as we can with the tiles as much as we can. If it's going to be like a big tile made boss, or if we're using sprites, let's not get crazy and make it too big. Let's try to make sure we're reusing tiles as much as possible, so that we have tiles left over for animated tiles. Where in this case it was like, let's design it and then let's make it work, even if that causes a lot of flicker. So yeah, I think having the dedication to design nicely, but to design with those limitations in mind, and to take the extra time to really be clever with tile use and animated tiles, and there are so many cases where, even if you come up with your original design, very often it's a question of nudging something over a few pixels, left or right or up or down, and suddenly it's in a new 16 by 16 area, so it can have its own tile palette out of the 4. And usually you can end up with something very similar to your original concept that doesn't need all of these like Band-Aid sprites fixing where you had missing colors, or like suddenly you're using blue sprites all over the place because you want that splash of extra color, and you didn't take the time to figure out how to get that level of colorfulness with the tiles. So anyway, that's what I would say there. Like, think that like they could have certainly come up with a really cool tile design that used this blue, and that magenta color. And then they could have easily worked out most of the blue accenting to use that same palette. You know what I mean?
Another thing about this that, I didn't really notice before, but
right.
You see how they've got, and they typically do this in MegaMan, when they're doing like a metallic object, they do that sort of banding with the style. You see on that bottom piece how they've got that going on.
Yeah.
But then they decided kind of arbitrarily to use this dithering on back there, and it doesn't by any means look that bad or anything.
Right.
But it's interesting that it sort of breaks that style when they could have done the banding there as well.
I'm going to just go out on a line and say it just would have looked better if they had stuck with vertical banding and just used the vertical line technique for the gradation instead of the raw dither. Because keep that in mind, artists and aspiring artists, when you are applying dithering, you're not just creating a gradient, you're adding texture. And there are a lot of different ways you can dither, and there are a lot of different ways you can simulate a gradient. And I think that looks so much better, and it is much more in keeping with metal. You're not adding this graininess to it, and it much better fits the other rendering of the other metal objects. But basically, they had to do another cylinder that was bigger, and they felt the need to have a smoother gradient to fit this larger curve. So they apparently didn't think of or weren't aware of the fact that they can create that gradient with horizontal lines instead of a checkerboard pattern.
Yeah, which
I mean, if you look through,
if you look throughout the series too, especially after this game, that banding style is what they run with for every type of shading, metallic shading that they do throughout the entire series, which is very typical of when you see people doing metal,
right? Even in like comic book illustration, not even just pixel art, absolutely.
But that was just a little side note, I guess.
But. All right. And let's see if there's any last thing we haven't. Let me drag this on here in case you see something. We did the fan. We did the flash we didn't show, but let's load that in and show people what I mentioned earlier. So this is just palette swapping to get this really cool effect of this these lights and darks alternating, and it's actually creating a smooth path. It's moving one tile at a time. So remember, they have the art for the tile. For each tile, they have the art, or a platform and wall tiles. They have the art for it using 2 different palettes. And then by swapping those 2 different palettes, the combination of those 2 things, they can actually have it travel. So they're not just color cycling, they're pointing a specific set of tiles to a specific tile palette.
Yeah, they're literally they decided, you know, this tile at this area at this time is going to be this palette, then we're going to shift it to a different palette.
So it's a different kind of color cycling, actually, than just moving the color indices. They might not be doing that at all. They're just saying, hey, this tile, it used to use this palette, like palette 1, now it's going to use palette 2. And,
yeah, that's true. I guess it's not technically the color cycling because they're not shifting. They're just because both
they're palette shifting. They're not
screen.
Right. They're not color cycling. They're palette cycling for the tiles.
Exactly.
Very similar
Swapping
end result,
palettes.
but there you go. But beautiful effect, and again, this is one of those things that is just extremely friendly for, like, it doesn't use a lot of resource, it doesn't use a lot of memory, and you get just a beautiful full screen effect. Just very great stuff. I'm glad we were able to end on a positive note, since I was really being mean about the proportions, and since we viciously criticized the checkerboard dither on that metallic surface. I hope everyone can forgive us, and remember, we love Mega Man 2, and Capcom in general always does AAA quality stuff. Big fan of Capcom in general, especially back then, and just the Mega Man franchise in particular.
And another quick example that we didn't talk about is the beams.
Beams. Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad we didn't forget this and wrap up the video.
Mm-hmm. These are obviously too wide to be sprites, so this is an example of like tile animation, and not necessarily animation, but replacing
Swapping
tiles
out
to create the illusion of animation. But they move so quickly that you don't really notice that they're jumping those 8 pixels every tile.
Right. And to put this in perspective to anyone that's never played this or never seen a long play, what's happening is you have these static levels with these holes in certain parts of the wall, and what's happening in the gameplay is you're trying to fall downward vertically to get through this area quickly into the next area, and so on and so forth. And there's a whole sequence of screens where these laser beams just come shooting out very quickly in these given areas. So you need to very quickly keep falling and moving left or right, picking the right way to fall down to avoid these laser beams. So fantastic, frantic gameplay, and just these beautiful large screen effects. And they did that. It's like a couple of tiles and then just swapping out background tiles with these tiles in a sequence to create these great animated full screen laser beam effects. Hi everyone, this is going to be a little spliced in bit. After talking about these beams, Corey noticed something important, so Corey, take it away.
Yeah, notice down here at the bottom of the screen you have this one beam that seems to be like, you know, going across half a tile, so we may have theorized incorrectly that the movement is the full 8 pixels. What we suspect is that there is some sort of extra either sprites or possibly animated tiles going on to get some smoother movement, at least on the edge of the beams. Right. So that the collision with Mega Man is a little more pixel accurate if he comes in contact with the edge of one. Yeah. As opposed to it just being a chunk, like an 8 pixel tile slamming into him, you know.
My best guess is it's just that they have, you can see that like there's very few tiles that they would need to like it's the same repeating pattern. Right. Over and over again, so they wouldn't need a lot of tiles to have animated tiles, so it's not just swapping out the tile with the beam tile. It's actually also showing like a halfway, like the beam is going halfway across that 8 pixel tile and then all the way across. So that's definitely a possibility, but as you said, it could very well be that they just have a sprite that's half a pixel or half a tile wide, always riding the edge of that beam.
Yeah, it could be either one. It would depend on, I guess you would have to do further analysis of what else is in that scene in terms of sprites, but It's probably just animated tiles, and they did the 4-pixel increments just to make it a little smoother.
Yeah, check that out. Like, that's really weird. Why is this particular 8-pixel set have the dither messed up? Well, like, what's up with that? Is that anywhere else too?
I don't know.
So that really makes your sprite theory more likely somehow. But why would it be there? Like, not at the very edge. Why would it be here? You know what I mean? Like, if they were lining up a sprite that otherwise looked the same, then you could get that distortion on the dither very easily. But if they're tiles and they're 8x8, why on earth would there ever be an errant tile that has the dither messed up? You know what I mean? Because you'd be using these tiles over and over again. Why is
that's
there...
a very strange anomaly. I'm not quite sure about that. Yeah,
that's a mystery. But
see, even as much as we know and as much analysis as we give, I mean, there are still these little mysteries that that crop up.
We can come up with educated guesses, but some things can throw you for a loop and really make you wonder what methods are they using under the hood that would lead to such... Like, it could be just an artist's error, but seriously, that should be the same exact 2 8x8 tiles there. It's exactly the same on the background. So, like, I can't imagine why. But then again, look at this. Like, then you have this tile, right? Which is different background, okay? So you see that little notch taken out of it on the top and that little extra bit of brown on the bottom. And that is, the dither is offset differently, so it's almost like they needed a tween tile. You know what I mean? To fix that. But no matter what, there was going to be, the dithering was going to be messed up somewhere, so why not leave it messed up where that tile meets that tile? I don't understand. It's like they wasted another tile, or they're using way more sprites than you think would be necessary.
We're going to have to...
the only other thing I could think of, let's look at how wide... No, because this is super wide, and MegaMan could be anywhere across this entire width. The last theory I had was maybe they're using a full, like, four sprites wide to cover the whole area, and that they weren't doing coordinate collisions to see if MegaMan was hitting this beam. Maybe they needed sprites for the collision, so they were actually using sprites in the areas where he might be collidable. Like, obviously here, he can never collide in here, so that doesn't need to be sprites. But in this area, maybe they needed sprites. But that's not the case, because for one thing, the seam is happening where he can't go, and then this is way too wide. They could never put sprites all the way across here. So I have no idea. But no matter what, something's going on, and we originally asserted that it was moving in 8-pixel steps, which is probably not the case due to this screenshot. They probably used animated tiles, but maybe sprites, or maybe both in some weird combination for some reason that we can't figure out. This kind of thing can be used to such great effect, and this is on the 8-bit Nintendo, which graphically was weaker than the Sega Master System. Let's pick a Master System game to do next. That could be really cool, because the technical aspect is so different. But I was going to mention, if you look at the Golden Axe or Altered Beast on the Sega Master System, they like, there's these big giant characters on screen for 8-bit games, and the background too. And the amazing thing is the Master System was powerful enough to allow you to display every background tile could be 16 colors, and you could draw, or it's called blit, you could blit an entire other 16 color tile image on top of that tile with the transparency. So for a lot of games where they needed really big objects on the Master System, and the two big examples are Golden Axe and Altered Beast, like, every moving character you see on the screen, you'll never see flicker no matter how many characters are in the same horizontal area, because it's all tile blitting. And the Master System was a graphical powerhouse in the day. And
and that's a whole discussion in and of itself. Like, the idea that even though the NES, was graphically inferior to the Master System, it was so extremely popular, and
had AAA studios,
Right. It had these big companies like Konami and Capcom
And
making these
Nintendo
amazing
themselves.
games for it,
Right.
and Nintendo as well, of
Right.
course. And Master System, even though it does have some great games on it, it didn't get that same
Right.
library,
Right,
and it wasn't
exactly.
nearly as popular because of
Right.
that. And it's sad because
Right.
had the NES had those same graphical
Right.
specs,
These games would have looked 16-bit. Absolutely.
right. It would have looked way better. I mean, maybe not so significantly better. It would have been mind blowing, but it would have been enough to push it.
I think in the
Into
hands
that
of
area,
I think in
yeah.
the hands of Capcom and
Yeah.
possibly even Nintendo, they would have looked darn near like a Genesis game. Like
Yeah.
like seriously, the power difference is pretty extreme. And most people don't know for the very reason you mentioned. On the 8-bit Nintendo, you had so many AAA companies and Nintendo themselves doing everything they could to just make the games on the system look great, despite those graphical limitations. And the opposite was true on the Master System. There were so fewer studios, and even the ones making games for the Master System, because they were going to sell, several orders of magnitude fewer copies, because the Master System was so less popular, that even the teams that were making games, even the ones that cared, they had a much smaller budget to make that game, because they were not going to get that kind of return.
Yeah, and marketing budget too. Like
Exactly.
there are a lot of really great examples of kind of terrible box art.
Legendary.
On,
The Master System is legendary
Master
for
System.
what was lovingly called clip art box art.
Yes.
Like, it was amazingly bad box art. And there's some games on all systems that are legendary for like really poorly drawn or whatever, but at least it was still original art. Like, literally, like if you looked at the shelf in a store that sold Sega Master System games, it was just a wall of generic clip art that was just sort of repurposed to put on a video game art. It was, or at least it looked that bad and that generic.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was all drastically lower budget, far fewer teams with less time, less money to be able to really put use to the immensely different and more powerful graphic abilities of the Master System. Like, you'd hardly know it with most Master System games that it was so much more powerful graphically.
Yep.
But it was, and it'll be interesting to do a Master System game and explain some of the differences in power that the Master System had. But don't get me wrong, like, I love both systems for very different reasons. Hands down, if I had to pick one system, like, the library of really fantastic games on the Nintendo is gargantuan compared to the library of great. There's a few like really great games on the Master System, but literally a few. Whereas, the Nintendo just had so many amazing studios making really great franchises. So it goes to show you, it's not all about the graphical horsepower. It's about how much time and dedication and love you can put into getting the most out of what the hardware can do. And obviously, gameplay trumps all, and in a video game, and well-drawn art with severe color limitations will look better than mediocre art drawn with, you can give a bad artist all the colors at their disposal, and the fact that they have more colors to work with might actually make the art look even worse.
Yeah, it's a possibility, yeah.
So, but anyway, I think we are pretty much done with Mega Man in general, so I won't go on sort of a big digression anymore. But, I think that is it, and we hope it was an enjoyable sort of review of Mega Man 2. Fantastic game, great art. Yeah, so thanks for watching, everyone. Was there any last-minute thought you had, or I don't want to cut it short?
No,
Okay.
However, I would highly recommend anyone who has any of these games that we review. Of course, we're doing very well-known classic games, but if you have not played these games, find a way to do it, and they are highly recommended.
Right.
Now, I will also say, though, there is the possibility that we may not always be doing the best games for this series. We might actually pick some bad titles.
Right. Specifically, like in the bad titles, it's much more likely that there's going to be bad art where we could be provide a lot more useful constructive criticism.
Exactly.
Where there's very little in games like this to really criticize. Like most of the caliber of the art is very high. So yeah, like one game I have in mind to do is that McDonald's game. It's what was it called, McKids or something like that?
Yeah, I think McKids.
Yeah, so that has some generally very, very mediocre art and some interesting things to talk about. So someday we'll pick bad ones, but for sure these first two and most of the videos we'll do will probably be games that are just classic for a reason, not just because they looked great, but because they were really fun. And Mega Man 2 is definitely one of those. So great game, despite the flicker. Amazingly, like just fantastically fun game. So anyway, I'll end the video there. Thanks so much everyone for watching, and tune in for the next one. It'll either be McKids or probably a Sega Master System game, so we can start to get into the drastically different technical considerations for that platform. So thanks again everyone for watching, and have a good rest of your day or night wherever you are.